Welcome everybody to our October webinar focused on endpoint protection and SQL security. We are just struck the new hour. We're at noon Mountain Time, 12 in the or 2 in the East, 11 in the Pacific. So we'll give people another 30 seconds or so to join. Really excited to have you here and glad you take some time with us. Hang on just a minute. Okay, I think we've given people enough time. So thank you again for joining us. We are using a slightly different platform within Teams. We don't anticipate any difficulties, but just in case there are, we just request a little patience. But it should be a smooth ride, and we're happy to have you here. Randy Knight, our SSG founder and principal consultant, is hosting. And with that, I will turn it over to him.
Okay, welcome back. It's been a while since we've had a webinar. We kind of take the summer off, and the summer off turned into October. So, this is obviously a pretty important topic right now. I gave this a kind of generic title. Jason's title was better. And really what we're doing is we're all painfully aware, I'm sure, of the impact of the CrowdStrike outage back in July. And so we're not going to spend a whole bunch of time on that. We'll talk about it a little bit, but more just use that as an opportunity to say, okay, endpoint protection is important, and talk about what, these things that, a lot of DBAs feel like are being kind of shoved down their throats by InfoSec are doing, and most importantly, how we should be participating in that and how we should protect our SQL servers. So this is our standard slide about SSG. Most of you, I think, are probably familiar with us. We're SQL server focused consulting company and managed service provider. So we do database managed services. So we're not going to, we're not an MSSP, so we're not doing endpoint protection for all of your environment. We're not an MSP, so we're not going to be, doing your Office 365 and your laptops and things like that. But we have managed services, remote DBA services for SQL Server itself. We do that. We do a lot of projects, and we do some coaching. If you're interested in, maybe you're an accidental DBA or you're self-taught and you want to level up your career, that's something else that we have. I'm Randy. I'm the founder, principal consultant, CEO, CTO, chief bottle washer, whatever you choose to call me. Sometimes that has to be behind my back, and that's okay. For SSG, I've been working with SQL Server. I decided I'm just going to leave this bio as over 2 decades forever. It's getting really close to 3 decades, and that makes me feel old. So we're just going to say over 2 decades. Prior to starting SSG in 2010, so we've been at it for about 15 years now. I was a database architect for a company called Match.com, which was really, really fun. We did things with SQL Server at that time, SQL Server 2000, that the rest of the IT world was saying you can't do with SQL Server. Back when people would talk about SQL Server not being able to scale, and we were serving 20 million plus page views a day, almost all of which were a database hit. So that was very foundational for me. We don't have a slide for him because he's pretty new to us, but I have a co-presenter here, or kind of a color commentator today, Arther Register, and I'll give Arthur a minute to introduce himself, but Arthur is a new member of our team who is not a DBA, focuses on infrastructure, and is a security expert. And so he's helping out our customers with some of those areas that they ask us to that aren't part of our core competency. and also is a great person to have with us here. So, Arthur, if you just want to introduce yourself real quick, and then we'll get started.
Hi, I'm Arther Register. I'm very security focused, as Randy mentioned. I come from a background where my mother was a technology teacher. My father was a cryptographer. They had me programming when I was in Montessori school on an Apple IIe, and then it just got worse from there, And I first job was doing data drop ceilings, and then about 10 years in the industry doing MSP and infrastructure for kind of high compliance sectors, a lot of law firms, and had a tremendous amount of Azure background. After that, I moved upstream to a major cybersecurity provider, and absolutely fell in love with some of the things that were happening in the area of zero trust and SASE and NGAV, some of these technologies. And then, after exiting successfully from there, I ran across SQL Solutions Group, and I am so happy to be part of the team. So it's really great to be here.
Thanks, Arthur. So yeah, I don't purport to be a cybersecurity expert by any stretch. We certainly have learned some things over the years, and when it comes to securing SQL Server, there are some very specific things. But so we're going to do this kind of like your favorite, as a lot of tech nerds like to say, your favorite sports ball contest, where I'll be play-by-play and we'll ask for color commentary from Arthur. So. Off we go. So we're going to start out with, what are we talking about with endpoint protection? Because we're not talking about endpoints from a SQL Server standpoint, right? Like a mirroring endpoint or AGs. So we'll define that. And I have August here. That should be July. But we'll briefly review the CrowdStrike incident. Hopefully that won't be too triggering and cause PTSD in all of us. I'm sure everybody was impacted at some level. If you weren't, you were very lucky. And then we'll talk specifically about SQL Server and what you should and should not be doing in your SQL Server environment when it comes to endpoint protection. We'll tell some war stories of endpoint protection gone wrong in SQL Server environments and some of the issues that we've seen it cause, and just kind of go from there. The nature of this, we don't have any demos. This is going to be discussion. So, Jason, one of the things we haven't tried before is enabling audio for participants, but that might be something worth doing if people want to raise their hand and rather than just typing questions. I would ask that if you have audio enabled, please mute yourself unless you're speaking. And let's give that a try. I did not give Jason any warning on this, so hopefully we won't run into technical difficulties, but let's give it a shot because I just think this is a topic that discussion and of course in-person presentations are always better for that, but let's see what we can do. So let's start with defining endpoint protection, and we'll go to all of our favorite source. We're not talking about SQL Server endpoints. And my simple definition of endpoint protection is if it's connected to the network, it's an endpoint, right? So laptops, desktops, phones, tablets, those are the main things that we think about when you talk about endpoint protection or end user devices. And, in the world of BYOD, bring your own device, which a lot of people are wanting to do, this has become a huge topic. And that's one of the things we'll talk about. But this is also servers of all types, right? And so what we have seen is we're going to talk about tools like CrowdStrike. We'll be using CrowdStrike as the example here. They're one of the top players, if not the largest. I know Gartner has CrowdStrike and Microsoft as the leaders in their Magic Quadrant. But there are others, right? There's a whole bunch of them, right? Microsoft has their offering. You've got SentinelOne, and then a lot of the historical antivirus vendors are players in this area too. Like your Sophos is one that comes to mind, right? So, and what's happening is, when I talk to DBAs, a lot of database people feel like this is being forced upon them by info security, right? and we're putting this agent on my server and I don't know what it's doing, and we think it's causing problems. And we know that antivirus, legacy antivirus is what we'll call it, has definitely caused problems over the years with SQL Server. So how do I know this isn't going to? So like a lot of things, there's some resistance in between database people and security. And so we're going to talk about what that is. Also IoT devices, right? And the way that I look at this is, does it have an IP address on your network? It's an endpoint, right? Does it have access to your network? It's an endpoint, right? Is probably the easiest way to describe that. Arthur, is there anything you would add to that in terms of just defining endpoint protection?
No, I think that's terrific, really, and it brings to light the visibility that we don't have in the traditional paradigm too, right? The visibility that's become possible with these new technologies like SIEM and some other things allow us to see, and secure networks in a way that's more holistic and complete, prevents kind of lateral attacks.
Right. On to our favorite authority on all things, Wikipedia. Right, this is the Wikipedia definition. Approach to the protection of computer networks that are remotely bridged to client devices. And they go through this list, right? And they talk about how it's evolved since the 2010s away from antivirus into next-gen antivirus, threat detection, investigation, and response. And that's one of the most critical pieces here, is that this is now an active technology, right? Mature organizations that are doing this right have a SIEM, which is was that security information event management, something like that.
Yes, sir. Yep.
It's tooling, right? Basically, it's for alerting anything that's happening on your network. And there will be a SOC, or a security operations center, that's actively reviewing those things so that we're catching things as they happen, right? As opposed to kind of the old school way of doing things, which was, a virus was found in the wild. We found out the signature, we update its definition, and we start scanning things for it. It's very reactive, right? And this is very active or proactive. CrowdStrike themselves, this is their definition of endpoint security. And there's links to all this stuff, by the way, throughout the deck, and there's a resource slide at the end. One of the things that I found interesting about CrowdStrike, since it is being pushed, to so many SQL servers, is that they specifically don't list servers here, right? What they have listed in their document are really what we classically think of as endpoints. So there's a link to this. This is just a little bit of a screenshot out of a kind of comprehensive document from CrowdStrike. Okay, is this just antivirus? And this is what Arthur alluded to. And I've kind of divided this as the legacy approach, and then we'll talk about the new way of doing things. Legacy approach was, corporate network focused, right? All the devices that are connected to our corporate network across our regions, whatever, which would include, if you connect via VPN, right? But enter the world of SaaS and remote work and so many other things going on. Bring your own device. That doesn't really work anymore, okay? We remember things like antivirus software, of course, have been around about almost as long as computers. Anti-malware, anti-phishing, right? We can think of lots of these tools that we've had over the years, but they're disconnected tools. They're reactive. And I think probably the biggest difference is that they're not actively being worked, right? Sure, you might have antivirus software that says, hey, here's these quarantine files. But unless there's some overworked sysadmin who's taking the time to go review those, we don't necessarily know about it, right? Which has, in this kind of brave new world, thanks to the breaches and the hackers and everything, organizations now have a CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, and a whole security team and a security operations center, right? That this is not just one of those things that overworked sysadmin has to do. All of these things are still components of the overall stack, right? But the new way of doing things is often referred to as EDR, endpoint detection and response, right? So not only do we want to protect the endpoints, we want to proactively do threat hunting and respond to what is going on, right? We want to find a breach before it becomes a breach, right? We don't want to wait until NIST identifies this and publishes a CVE and says, "Oh, here's something you need to watch for," right? Proactive versus reactive. Again, SIEM and SOC are probably the two most important pieces of this that particularly smaller organizations are still not doing, right? Maybe they've invested in, the small business CrowdStrike or similar tooling, which is good. But if we're not having these events go to a SIEM, if we don't have a SOC, and then you say, well, how does a small organization afford a SOC? Like everything else, you outsource it, right? There are managed SOC services that there's a whole category of managed services now called MSSPs, which are managed security services providers that do just this, right? So kind of like SSG does managed services for your SQL Server databases, there's this whole category of companies that does security. It's also targeted at a cloud-based or SaaS model, right? Instead of having an appliance that's on our corporate network that all of our corporate endpoints have to be enrolled in and deal with, this lives in the cloud, right? It can be integrated with the SaaS apps that you're interacting with. I like to say that whether you believe it or not, every IT organization in 2024 is hybrid cloud, right? There are some that claim to be cloud only, but I have a hard time. Maybe that if you don't have a domain, okay, you're cloud only, but you still have people on laptops accessing those cloud resources, right? There's something happening that's not in the cloud, right? So these technologies are designed to be cloud-based, right? All right, so that brings us to our case study. And, as bad as this event was, this is not an anti-CrowdStrike thing by any stretch. In fact, I think CrowdStrike is really good technology. And, we've had these events over the years, right? We've had, the fact of the matter is that because things are becoming cloud-based, because things are so integrated and distributed at this point, even if you think that what you have is not distributed, there's so many libraries being used in software. Think about the SolarWinds incident, right? A few years ago, right? That SolarWinds Orion, there was a huge breach, right? And there's people to this day that, SolarWinds is a 4-letter word because of that. Well, that was because of an open source software library that they were using in their on-premises product, right? So, I kind of think of this almost like I think of privacy, right? In 2024, if you really want to have privacy, go be a hermit, live in the mountains like the Unabomber. That's the only way that you are truly private. That's the same thing in IT, I think, in 2024. If the only way to say that you're isolated from all this, don't use software that anybody else has ever written and have an air-gapped network. Neither of which are doable, right? Okay, so what happened? CrowdStrike pushed out an update to their agent, and I have a link coming up here to their RCA that they published publicly, which is pretty good. About the breakdown in their processes, what wasn't tested, and what caused this. Affected 8.5 million systems, estimated $10 billion in damage, put systems into either a boot loop or recovery mode, blue screens, blue screens, blue screens, right? And the really bad part about this was that it required a boots on the ground fix, right? We couldn't push out another update to hit undo. And that's because these agents run in kernel mode. They're not using like Windows APIs, right? They're running in what's called ring 0. And Arthur, if you want to add some context to that about why that's necessary, that would be great. But that was the event, right? There's a Wikipedia article about it. There's a link to the RCA. Arthur, anything you want to add on that in terms of or even just the last couple of slides? Feel free to interrupt me because I'm pretty good at just forging ahead. So.
No, I think it's great. I mean, they're very low level tools, right? So when you're talking about the way that all of these next generation antiviruses work, the idea is they sit and interdict in memory, right? Which is a very different concept than the way that traditional antivirus scans, where you're scanning files for known signatures, is, right? So this has moved to like a heuristic behavioral model, which is a really kind of a neat thing, where this is how you find the 0 days before the 0 days occur, right? And as you know, with a strong systems administrative background, that was one of the things that used to keep me up at night, right? Which was, how would I even know if I was breached? How would I even know if somebody was poking me in a device that wasn't being monitored with all these other monitors? So the network itself really becomes a critical component in the security, and that really starts to impact specialized devices like SQL servers the most, right? Because you have to secure those devices in a zero trust network architecture, right? And the whole concept is that you treat your own network as adversarial. There is no trusted zone anymore, right? The concept of this trusted LAN is abolished, and you assume that your own network is potentially adversarial. And in such a model, there is a very specific way to configure some of these advanced use cases like dedicated SQL servers. So I don't want to spoil what I think the coolest part is, which is coming up in a little while.
Okay, so what was the SQL Server impact to this? In most cases, and we had, I would say, I didn't do the math, but I'd say probably about 80% of our customers were CrowdStrike shops that were impacted by this, right? And their SQL servers definitely went down, right? Any Windows box that had this had CrowdStrike Falcon agent on it went down hard, right? But after the fix was put in and the OS drive came back up, in most cases SQL servers were fine, right? We had, I think we might have had one or two customers with databases that came up suspect, but guess what? Those were databases that they weren't doing the right things with to start with anyway, in terms of check DBs and so forth. If you have solid hardware, if you're not right caching, right, if you're doing the right things with SQL Server, it was pretty clean. There was an SSRS issue that we saw with, I think, 3 of our customers, that basically, for whatever reason, the reporting services executable, the service just got corrupted, and it required some intervention, and eventually they came out with a fix for it. But on day one, we had a couple of customers that we had to reinstall SSRS, and guess what? One of those hadn't done. Backed up the SSRS encryption key, which if you want to take a report server database and point a new SSRS installation at it, you've got to have that encryption key. So another, pretty well-known member of the SQL Server community, Joey D'Antoni, published an article in, I think, Redmond Mag back in July. And his take on this was that this was a great DR exercise, right? A real world DR exercise, right? And so things like this, we had a customer that didn't have their encryption key backed up. So we had to wipe out all the encrypted passwords stored in SSRS, and they had to go fix that manually, right? So not good. Opening it up just to question or here's just for those who are on the call, are there other impacts that you saw? Now, I'm not talking about downstream impacts, right? That, oh, our SQL server was down for 12 hours and that caused this, and this. I'm talking about SQL server itself coming back up cleanly, and so forth. Anything else that anybody experienced?
Randy, I'm not entirely sure we will hear our audience. I'm not seeing any mic control options.
Okay. I should have thought of that before 5 minutes before the webinar. But you can put questions in chat too. We'll go ahead and move on. But overall, aside from just two things, just the massive downtime. And secondly, that, in many organizations, it doesn't matter what your job is in IT, it was all hands on deck in terms of helping bring all these systems back up, right? So I'm sure there's a lot of folks out there that experience that. Okay, enough about that. Let's talk about SQL Server. Historically, antivirus on SQL servers has been something that people have wanted to do. The important thing is exclusions. On the resources slide, there's links to a couple of Microsoft articles on this about if you're using traditional antivirus that is scanning files and processes, like Arthur mentioned, that you need to exclude, right? Your basically any of your SQL Server data files, log files, backups, error logs. Typically what we have told people is that if your SQL Server set up right and there's nothing on the C drive, and there's nothing on the data drives besides SQL Server files, just exclude those drives from your scans. The other one is scanning the SQL Server.exe process. Unlike other processes, that's the service, right? SQL Server does a tremendous amount of I/O. And a lot of these things are designed to intercept every I/O and scan it. And that just doesn't work when you're doing that much I/O, right? Another area, filter drivers. These are DLLs that run in process with SQL Server exe that are doing the same thing, intercepting all those I/Os. And when we get to war stories, I'm going to tell one about this that was a little bit difficult to find, but was pretty interesting. The other thing where I really want to focus the remainder of this webinar is that most of the types of threats that we're talking about for a dedicated SQL server that we're following all the security practices we're about to talk about really don't apply, right? Are you worried about phishing on your SQL server? You got bigger problems if you're letting people open a web browser and click on a link that goes to the public internet on the SQL Server console, right? Malware. What is this software that you're installing on your SQL Server that has malware with it, right? Now, I've heard the joke made that the security agents are malware, but I don't believe that. So if you think about all that host of threats that we're trying to find and detect for endpoints, laptops, phones, tablets, right? The opportunity to have those kinds of things happen should not ever happen on a SQL server, right? Okay, so let's move on to what you should be doing. This is not a complete hardening, CIS benchmark, NIST for your SQL server, right? These are the things that I would consider the basics. And some people will see this list and say, if you think that's basic, I got a long way to go. And that may be true, right? But this is security 101 for making sure your SQL server boxes as endpoints are not vulnerable, right? Make sure your boxes are configured per best practices, right? Your service accounts, are not local administrators or even worse, domain admins, right? Make sure your, C drive has just the OS and all of your SQL Server stuff is on dedicated volumes. Make sure you're following the principle of least privilege, right? I can't tell you how many supposedly highly secure environments we get into that have a lot of these things, and it can be a hassle, right? Because if you have a SQL server that's not allowed to get on the internet, well, there's a PowerShell module I need to install. I can't install it from the PowerShell gallery, right? Like it can be a hassle. But then when you get into the SQL server, everything's SA or DB owner, right? So, InfoSec is doing their job, but I would submit that the DBAs are not doing their part in those environments, or they're not being allowed to do their part. No internet access from the SQL Server console. SQL servers should be dedicated boxes, right? Don't install things on the SQL Server box that could compromise it, right? If your vendor says their software has to live on the SQL Server, hold them to that. Make them prove why. And from a security standpoint, I would submit from an InfoSec standpoint is if some vendor has software that's doing something really stupid, like using shared memory to connect to SQL Server so it has to be on the same box, that's not a vendor you should be using, right? If you actually care about security, right? Make sure you're firewalling things local on the box, right? There's a very small set of ports that you could ever need with SQL Server. In a simple environment, really just one, right? TCP 1433, right? If you're using mirroring or availability groups, you've got, default port is 5022 for endpoints, right? Many years ago, there was actually a SQL Server virus called SQL Slammer, and you have to probably be old like me to remember this, but it was a UDP 1434 exploit. Guess what runs on UDP 1434? The SQL browser service, right? So disable the browser service. You don't need it. All it does for you is if you're running SQL Server on a different port or you're running named instances on different ports, you have to know the port instead of asking it. Well, granted, it's security by obscurity, which is not that great, but if you're running SQL Server on different ports, you should have that port in your connection strings, right? You don't need SQL browser, okay? We also should have our SQL servers on isolated subnets. Have a subnet only for database servers. Don't put your app servers and database servers and everything else on the same subnet. Isolate your non-production and your production, right? Arthur made a comment, and I think I added this a little bit later the other day. He said, SQL servers should be as close to air-gapped as you can have them and still be functional, right?
Absolutely.
And that's really what we're looking for, right? Console access should be rare and controlled, right? We have a customer that asked us to license RDS service broker, whatever it's called, so that they could have more than 2 RDP connections to their production servers, right? And to me, that shows a fundamental problem with how we're doing business, right? It should be a very rare occurrence that you need to connect to the actual console of the server versus a workstation. In our managed services environment, we have a jump box essentially that's set up for us on every customer's network, and that's where we do all our work from. If we need to go to the console, it's because, a drive needs to be expanded or something that is very specific that you have to be on that Windows console, right? Your InfoSec team worries about the box, the OS. You need to worry about what's inside the box. And there's a parallel here with what we get into with SQL Server performance, right? We have our sysadmin teams, our network monitoring teams, whoever it is, that's very good at monitoring the OS and saying, hey, your SQL server is at 100% CPU, but they can't tell you what's using that CPU, right? A DBA has to get inside SQL Server to figure that out. And the same thing applies to security, right? And that's what I see in these environments where, most of these practices are being followed outside of the database realm, but when you get onto the SQL Server configuration itself, they're not, right? Principle of least privilege, right? One of the big lessons learned in a lot of organizations is that this is always easy to do at the beginning and hard to do later on. We just went through an exercise with a customer who was doing a migration and wanted to do some hardening. As part of that, switch from standard authentication to AD authentication and go to principle of least privilege. So they had a application service account that was a DB owner in all the databases, or maybe even an SA, something like that. And so we went through the process of figuring out what permissions it needs. And that was kind of painful, right? Because we might think we know, but we don't until we use it, right? So principle of least privilege is important. Whenever possible, use integrated authentication instead of standard authentication. Microsoft has finally made standard auth better by in 2022 in the most recent version of the drivers. The default is to require encryption on connections. And I hope everybody is aware, if you do not have an encrypted connection between the client and the SQL server, and you're using standard authentication, the username and password are almost clear text on the network. They're UU encoded, right? So anybody with a sniffer and half a brain can get those passwords, right? And this is why for years we've said use Windows authentication, Active Directory based, right? Use group managed service accounts wherever possible, right? If you're not familiar, a GMSA is a service account that has a password. I don't want to say it doesn't have a password because it does, but it's this horribly complex password that no human ever sees, right? The password's maintained by Active Directory. It's rotated by Active Directory on a regular basis. I think the default is every 30 days, right? And the way they work is you have this GMSA that's been created in Active Directory, and you give specific principals, i.e. computers, SQL Server boxes on the network, permission to use that GMSA. So when your service starts up, it calls out to Active Directory and it says, hey, I'm prod SQL 1, and I want to use this GMSA account. And Active Directory says, are you allowed to use this GMSA account? You are, and it gives you the password, right? Very, very easy way to do managed service accounts. One of the long-standing best practices for SQL Server security is to rotate your service account passwords, right? And, you know, this would be another great one for a show of hands. How many are in organizations that are doing that regularly? Hardly anybody. Because it's the law of unintended consequences, right? What are all the things that are using that service account? And we have to restart the services, and we have, you know, multiple SQL servers all using the same service account. So now we have to coordinate that to restart the SQL services on all of those guys at the same time, right? It's one of those things that it's a big hassle, so it doesn't get done. GMSAs completely eliminate the need to have to manage that.
Probably the closest to hack proof that you can get with an account. They're not designed to interact with the GUI, which makes them really, really, really neat from a security standpoint.
That's a good point, Arthur. They're also, you cannot log in interactively with a GMSA account, right? So the other thing is introduce your app dev team to this, right? You can use GMSA in .NET, and you can create a login that's a GMSA, right? So throughout your environment, all of these services are using GMSAs. You know, this is particularly important too when, you know, most Active Directories at this point are integrated with some solution for MFA, right? Whether it's, you know, Entra through, you know, hybrid Active Directory and Entra, whether it's something like Okta or Duo or all the, you know, there's a lot of providers out there, right? Well, what's one of the things you have to do with service accounts? You have to exclude them from MFA so that when the service starts, someone doesn't have to get a notification and authorize that, right? So now we have service accounts out there that can be used to log in interactively, that probably have more permissions than they need, that have a password that's stored somewhere, and in the worst case on some spreadsheet, not even encrypted, that lots of people know, right? That's a recipe for problems, and GMSAs eliminate that. Remove unnecessary services, right? Can't tell you how many SQL servers we see that have SQL Server Agent, full text, SSRS, SSIS, every possible SQL Server service that comes out of the box. Why? because it was a default installation and most of those things are not being used, right? Minimally disable them, best to uninstall them, right? Every service that's running is an attack area, right? It's a possible place for a breach, right?
Surface.
Attack surface, thank you.
Yep, absolutely.
Yep. So the thing that I want to point out here is that this list is not new. The only thing that's newer than, they I think in the Wikipedia, they use 2010 as kind of the breaking point for, next generation security versus legacy, right? The only thing on this list that has changed since 2010 is GMSAs. We didn't have GMSAs in 2010. Everything else, these have been SQL Server security best practices for decades, right? So I think the biggest message on this CrowdStrike incident is not, oh man, CrowdStrike tanked my SQL server. It's, was my SQL server secure to start with without CrowdStrike, right? Am I pushing back against InfoSec because I don't want them to put their stuff on my server? Well, I better be able to show them what I am doing, right? So really good, just kind of baseline. Again, this is not a hardened SQL server by any stretch, right? This is just baseline stuff that you should be doing. Protect the network. That's one of the things that, and Arthur alluded to this earlier, and I'll let you talk about this a little bit, Arthur. But
sure,
these next gen tools, zero trust networking, they're trying to find things like distributed attacks on the wire before they ever get to the server, right? And the SOC is involved, and if you're doing that, then your antivirus, next gen, CrowdStrike on the server becomes redundant. So Arthur, do you want to add some?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. So there's effectively this concept of secure access services edge, right? This SASE model. And there are a number of vendors that have these monitored SASE, abilities. And what they can do is packet inspect, deeply into the data before it ever hits, right? So the ultimate goal is to ingest everything that you can on a network. You want to see all of your routers, which is something that we historically haven't necessarily seen correlated actively with our servers, right? So one question I always ask people is like, let's put on that hat, right? Let's put on that gray hat for a second and look and say, if I were to poke you in this router in location A, and I were to turn around and poke you in location B, would you know? Right? I mean, and the short answer is that's why SIEM is so important from that visibility and the SOC, the human monitoring of it. Zero trust we touched on previously before, which is that assuming that it's adversarial, there should be nothing granted. There is no trusted LAN any longer, really. I mean, because of the horizontal nature of the attack, right? They call it lateral movement. So what ends up happening is you end up, if you get onto the network, you can laterally move across the network, leaving very small footprints on every box that you touch, right? And if you don't have something like a SIEM and a SOC for monitoring, you're probably, you might hear about it on the news, right? You wouldn't know until after it already executed. That's the problem. So with that in mind, taking that zero trust, no extra access, scanning on the wire, you really have eliminated, and then adding to that, I think probably the biggest thing, which is that GMSA account, right? Where it should be so hardened effectively that adding an agent to watch in process memory, well, there should be nothing in memory in process, right? Other than SQL Server, if you're doing it correctly, you got to isolate your assets. That's my 2 cents on the protect the network. Certainly taking that zero trust, as defined by foresters, right? Like taking that approach that it should be least privilege access, and you should not be granting privileges to anything that doesn't strictly have a need for it, right? And I think the GMSA takes that to the next level, which is your SQL Server doesn't need a user interface, right? There doesn't need to be a human readable password. So it makes the most sense.
Okay, so what do we see as outcomes for our customers? And this is coming back to the incident in July, but and again, back to this was a live and in color DR event for a lot of people, right? To exercise your DR plans. Again, my estimate is that about 80% of our customers had impacted SQL servers. We have a very large customer, household name, that was a CrowdStrike environment who had literally, hundreds of servers, not counting, endpoints, laptops, and things like that, but just servers that went down because of this. Their database team were successful in convincing InfoSec not to put CrowdStrike on the SQL servers. And of course, they came out looking like heroes because none of the SQL servers went down. But what I would point out about that, it was because their SQL Server environment was secure with all the above things we're talking about. Okay, this is not a high security environment necessarily. They wouldn't like for me to say that, but this is not military or something that's Red Forest, like hardcore hardened, right? But the SQL servers are isolated. They're doing the things the InfoSec is doing the things on the network and throughout the environment. They're doing all the things that we have talked about here. And so they're able to go back to their InfoSec and say, hey, we've just seen these things cause problems in the past and we really don't want it. And here's what we're doing and here's why, right? 3 of our customers had the SSRS issue that I mentioned earlier. One of them didn't have the encryption key backed up, which was a great lesson learned for them. One of the things that I wanted to point out, of all those 80% of customers who did have CrowdStrike on their SQL servers and their SQL servers went down, I would say most of them are not following the SQL Server hardening practices that we just talked about, right? And this comes back to, InfoSec cares about everything up to and including the OS. They don't know anything about what's going on inside SQL Server. That's your responsibility as a DBA, right? Okay, few war stories. And these are things that, experiences like these are what, are the reasons DBAs, try to push back against these things, right? This was a few years ago. This was a filter driver. This was Sophos in this case. It was a Sophos buffer overrun protection, I think. And basically, it was a DLL that ran in process with SQL Server, right? And it intercepted all the SQL Server IOs to scan them. So what's the symptom? The SAN, everything in storage up to and including the Windows operating system reported extremely low latency, no problems with storage. SQL Server reported extremely high latency in the hundreds of milliseconds, right? Both were correct, right? Because what's happening there? SQL Server requests an IO, Sophos intercepts it, scans it before it gets sent to Windows. So from the time it arrived at Windows, the latency was very low. But that filter driver was creating an extreme amount of latency, which translated to, and we're talking about disk latency here, right? Serious performance problems, right? We've seen this for years with antivirus, right? Scanning the SQL Server exe process, scanning MDF files, LDF files, and so forth, right? I can't count how many times I've seen that problem in my career, right? One of the things that I would point out, though, is that this, next-gen antivirus and the way it works, one of the big selling points of the CrowdStrikes of the world is that our stuff doesn't have the performance impact that traditional antivirus does. And to a large degree, that's true. because of where it lives and that it's doing things in memory. And Arthur can tell you much more about that than I probably even care to ever know in terms of how it works. But it does eliminate some of these issues, right? I would say this antivirus exclusions issue is the #1 negative impact we've seen with security software on SQL Server. Failed login alerting, right? So one of the things that we monitor with SQL Sentry in our managed services is high number of failed logins, so we see that a lot. We also see quite a few error 20s being, I believe it's 20, written to the SQL Server log that will say something like malformed login packet or something like this, right? What those usually are is penetration testing, right? So your security team is running a pen testing appliance on a regular basis or irregular, depending upon how good they are, on your network, right? And they're trying to break into your SQL Server, right? SQL Server detecting that, right? So #1, you should be alerting on this. #2, you want to work with your security team to know what IP addresses those are coming from so that you can exclude them so that if you get these alerts, you know they're real, right? Because what we see often is we'll raise this issue. We'll say, hey, this is a lot of times this is pen testing. Can you get with your security team? And they're like, oh yeah, we see that all the time. It's security. So what are we doing there? We are completely discounting the fact that this could be an actual network breach, right? We have alert fatigue, right? That we see so much of this, right? And so one of the things I'm going to get to in this summary is that, like everything else, DBAs have historically been the no people, right? We want to do this, no, right? Developers want to do this, no, right? And we want to work with our security team, right? And especially in larger organizations where things are more siloed, sometimes that becomes a political football, right? That database team wants to do this, developers want to do this, security wants to do this, and whose budget does it come out of to fix these things and those types of things. And I think the message here is let's work together, because what I always say is, at the end of the day, the customer, whether that's an internal customer, end user, the business as we call it, or external, doesn't care whose fault it is, right? If there's a breach and PII is released to the wild, your customers aren't going to care. Well, the DBAs have been trying to get developers to use always encrypted for the last 3 years and they refuse. That's not going to be an excuse, right? And so, security is everybody's job. And I think that's the important part of this. Okay, here's a few resources. The first 2 links there are the antivirus exclusions and also one about filter drivers. There's some Microsoft articles on SQL Server security best practices. A lot of the stuff that we've gone over, again, this is not hardening, right? If you want to get into that, there's a link there to the CIS benchmarks. And so, that's those are some of the fun projects that we've done. Are people who actually, they're going for, SOC 2 compliance, right? And going in and identifying these things and helping. And again, this is always easier to do when you're building the application than to have to harden it later and find out all of the unintended consequences of that, right? Okay, to summarize, don't rely on InfoSec. Okay, SQL Server security, if you're a DBA, it's your responsibility. Show them what you have done. Show them what you've tried to do but get resistance, right? I know there's people out there that are saying, I know all these things. I've known all these things for years. I can't get the developers to start using integrated authentication because Kerberos 2-hop is hard. And it's easier just to put the SQL Server username and password in an app config file. So get InfoSec involved in that. Say, hey, here's all the things I have been able to accomplish. Here are the things I've tried to accomplish, and I could really use your help in making this happen, right? Don't fight against them, right? Educate yourself, educate them, right? Become the expert on data security, SQL Server security. We haven't even touched on things that we want to do with the data itself, right? Principle of least privilege, sure. But how do we protect PII, PHI? Talk about things like TDE so that your databases are encrypted at rest. Talk about things like always encrypted so that at a column level, you have public key encryption so that even a DBA can't see what's in that field. They see the encrypted value unless they have the ability to decrypt it with the public key, right? Data stewardship and governance, right? Things like Microsoft Purview, right? And those types of tools to understand what data you have, right? I can't say how many times I've heard people talk about, yeah, they're really pushing us to make sure our PII is protected, but we don't even know where all the PII is, right? And if you're not familiar, PII, personally identifiable information, right? You'll hear PII, you'll hear PHI, which is in healthcare and HIPAA, right? Personal health information, right? And so, and we, being in the business we're in, we interact with everyone from, very immature kind of cowboy IT environments to, we even did a project with the US Navy, right? On a classified network, right? And everything in between. We worked with a customer that because of the business we're in, they were subject to HIPAA and FDIC for compliance, right? Huge compliance footprint in that kind of an environment, right? So, if this is an area that you need help in, we can help, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Do harden your SQL Server to the appropriate baseline, even if it's just this kind of, security 101 stuff that we've covered in this presentation, right? If you go beyond that, if you look at some of the, NIST or CIS benchmarks, things like that, that's even better. Do implement principle of least privilege. Okay, Arthur, anything else that you want to add to wrap things up, and then we'll open it up for Q&A.
The biggest thing is observe, 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 right? The closer you can get to a single pane of glass from your observability is huge, right? Ingest as well, ingest as much information as you possibly can. The operational benefits, the secondary operational benefits of implementing some of these best practices for things like SIEM, I think are a lot of times undervalued by the people. I think a lot of times people don't realize how much time they spend looking for answers that could be easily provided by a SIEM, right? Because it's a new technology, which makes sense. So it's not security only, it's visibility. So I think that's a big part of it.
That's a great point, but that's also one of the things that I always like to point out. As much as we like to joke about it, this is one of the areas where AI and particularly machine learning really shine, right? I look at someone like Microsoft, Windows Defender. 10 years ago, Windows Defender was the laughingstock of antivirus.
It really was.
It really was. Now it's one of the best. Why is that? Who has telemetry from every Windows operating system being sent to them and can do machine learning on that and build that? Now you can call that antitrust. You can say it's an unfair competitive advantage, but the reality is there, right? if you look at, if you look at the telemetry that goes from just a Windows workstation back to Microsoft, and you multiply that by, well, let's see, the CrowdStrike was 8.5 million systems, and that's certainly not every Windows system, right? So, multiply that by those millions of OSs out there that are providing Microsoft that information. What they did is they got really good at ingesting and digesting and using machine learning on that implementation, right? And it's funny because it used to be the rule of thumb is the first thing you do with a Windows OS is put a good antivirus on it instead of the built-in one, right? And now, from an antivirus baseline security thing, just the Windows Defender stuff is pretty good, right? It doesn't do all the things that like a CrowdStrike or some of these other next gen ones does, but the things that it does, it's good at. So, all right. Do we have any questions? This format, Jason, I don't see like a Q&A. Is it just the chat or how does that
there's
work?
a Q&A.
Okay.
And there's no Q.
Okay.
There's no Q in the Q&A.
Well, this has been a pretty dry topic, right? There's not demos, there's not cool stuff, but an important one, right? And particularly in light of every time you hear now this CrowdStrike event was not a breach, right? A lot of times what you hear about are big data breaches, right? Look at that as an opportunity. This is an opportunity to talk to your leadership about, hey, here are these security things that I feel like we really need to do in our environment. And here's an example of what happened because they hadn't done it, right? And it's, every time there's a big published breach, it tends to have a silver lining of budgets being released for security initiatives. So it's kind of, the old thing is that, security and performance come last, right? Particularly with product, right? Because, if I can build a snazzy new feature to sell to customers, or I can make the system more secure or more scalable, product and marketing folks are going to choose the snazzy new feature every time, right? And it isn't too many organizations learn these lessons the hard way, I guess is what I'm trying to say there. So thanks everyone for your time. I hope this was valuable. And the slide deck and the webinar recording will be on YouTube. The slide deck will be available for download. Jason will send that all out to everybody. So stay safe out there.
Yes, thanks, Randy. During the webinar, as you hopefully noticed, I've posted links that Randy had in his slides, and our recap email in the next 24 or 48 hours will have those as well, and the slide deck, of course. So we'll get that out to you as soon as we can. Appreciate everybody joining us, and hope you enjoyed this. We'll let you know soon about our next webinar. Thank you.
All right.